In the first 4 chapters of the textbook and in the first discussion, which highlighted some things from those chapters, what was covered was important innovations in the development of human beings culturally, tools of speech, and the ability to communicate in writing, which is the visual counterpart of speech. So the origins of writing, their impact on the social order of the day, the economic progress, and what we'll call technological and cultural developments were highlighted. And cultural perceptions of writing were also discussed. Going from hand-copied manuscripts into printing was a huge deal and changed the landscape for education and literacy and cultural exchange. The invention of typography is one of the bigger episodes of history. To store and retrieve and document knowledge, to exchange ideas, to disseminate information with increasing rapidity beyond just what verbal capability would allow was a huge deal. Even now in our current age, making the connection between the 1400s and our current day, the constant ability to be connected and exchange ideas and information is another kind of revolution or renaissance, if you will. When paper became the preferred substrate, various paper makers would want to identify their mills as exclusive from others. And so the first identifying mark was the watermark. Before there were actual logos in use printed on paper, there were identifying marks embedded into paper. And this is a French watermark, a series of them, showing a siren or a two-tailed mermaid. And a watermark is a translucent motif that's produced by pressure when paper is being made, and it leaves a mark that's visible when the paper is held up to the light. And the mermaid designs were produced by bending wire and attaching the wireframes to the paper molds. The concept of paper came from China to Europe via the Middle East. And the first paper mill, the Fabriano mill, which still produces fine watercolor and fine art papers today, was established in the late 13th century in Italy. And I just want you to see a connection to this. According to Starbucks, the official history behind their logo, because what does a mermaid have to do with coffee, but the idea is that the original logo wanted to embody the seafaring ways of the coffee trade. And so a siren or a mermaid was a very appropriate symbol for that. They came up with the original mermaid logo with the idea that they said it was based on a Nordic woodcut from the 16th century. Unfortunately, there were no Nordic woodcuts in the 16th century. And it's more likely that the original design was based on the very French wireframe watermarks we just looked at, because there is a very obvious relationship. So as we go through, start looking for connections. Look for the now and the then, or the before and the after, because these connections exist all the way through. We do not create in a vacuum. There's always something that's going to spark a new idea. So something existing will give rise to something new. What has been will give rise to what will be. Block printing originally began in China with playing cards and textiles, and was also carried on in Europe. But one of the earliest uses of block printing in Europe was the idea of tracts, small pamphlets that would teach about piety or teach about matters of faith or teach about God. This one is the Annunciation to Mary by the angel Gabriel. Block printing was a way of mass producing and mass distributing ideas. rather than gathering people on a street corner or spreading via word of mouth, a person could hand somebody a tract and they could look at it and gain understanding. In this case, the dominant visuals are illustrations, and the type itself is very much secondary in terms of the overall proportion of the page. So this was used for more illiterate audiences, where this actually becomes more of a headline or a caption, but the story is basically told through the illustration. And this is very similar to the idea of the picture book versus the storybook versus the books for young readers versus the standard trade novel. The storybook is very heavy on pictures and light on text. Some storybooks have, they're picture books. They have no text in them, and the story is told just by looking at the sequence of visual images. Storybooks have a little more text in them, and those who are learning to read will get along really well with minimal text and lots of picture. Books for young readers, if you grew up in the United States, you probably read Charlotte's Web or Willy Wonka, and there were occasional illustrations in the book. The more literate the audience, the less picture you need. So pictures become enhancements and illuminations rather than the main vehicle for conveying the story. This is a page from an Ars Moriendi, which is a book on how to prepare for dying. And this montage juxtaposes the deathbed scene with the subject's estate. So we have the person on the deathbed with all the people around, and then we have the person's estate being dealt with in terms of, this is going to exist after you do, so what are you going to do with this while you're still here? That's basically the idea. And notice that the amount of textual content, if this is a two-page spread, is now about equal. We have a full-page illustration with a little bit of a headline or a little bit of caption going on, and then we have textual copy. This indicates that there is an increase in literacy. Gutenberg was the first to pull all the components together to print typographic books. We had the substrate, we had the idea of movable type, we had the block printing, and so Gutenberg coalesced everything into a printing process that would allow for regularity and mass production. And books printed by Gutenberg's method are ideal in that they combine text and illustration on the same page. Movable type is set in any shape around a wood block, and the raised surfaces of both the type and the image receive the ink at the same time, and they transfer it to the paper at the same time in one single impression. This is a letter of indulgence which the Catholic Church was using to absolve people of their sins, and these were very much in use right around the time of the Reformation. And this is a typographic style that mimics the earlier calligraphic indulgence letters. This is a spread from the Gutenberg Bible. It's highly legible, and it has a really nice textural quality with the repetition of the letter forms down the columns. It has generous margins. It's very carefully produced. Notice that the recto and the verso, the right hand and the left hand pages are mimicking each other. They're mirror images of each other, this being the division line between the two pages, but the width of the gutter between the columns is the same. It has larger bottom margins and then less distance on the side margins and even less on the top margin, and then less in the gutter. And one of the reasons for margins was not only to highlight the text itself or the important stuff on the page, but to allow for the handling of pages without getting into the inked area. The color was added by hand. There would be an illuminator who would come in and do the initial caps and the red lettering after the pages were printed. Another important development in the 1400s was copper plate engraving, which is a printing technique that allowed for greater intricacy and detail in illustrations. And this is a piece by the master of the playing cards depicting the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. In Germany, the illustrated book combined woodblock and typographic printing techniques. In this book, the printer was Johann Zeiner. The woodcuts are all designed in rectangles, and the rectangles are the width of the text columns, and so everything is justified and flush. Notice that there's not a lot of white space. If you compare this to the Gutenberg Bible, in this page there's very little white space to support. There's very little breathing room. So it's just a different style of page layout. But the attention to the idea of implied line and unifying the page elements via implied line alignments is very important. One of the things that typography did was that it facilitated linear thought and logic, and also enabled scientific inquiry. It also fostered individualism, which is a dominant aspect of Western culture. So individual study is made possible by personal books and print reproductions, and ideas were widely distributed in written form. People did not necessarily have to come together to study from one person. It could be a one-on-one situation, or via a book a person could just read and learn. In this Kroberger, the two-page spread from the Nuremberg Chronicles, white space is used to a greater degree, but there's still dense textural effects between the illustrations and the text. It does make it a little hard to read. You can see that the value patterning really creates an overall surface understanding, and it takes the eye a while to read, and it takes the eye a while to kind of navigate all the detailing in the illustrations. Many woodblock illustrations were hand-painted, such as is depicted here. Again, a page from the Nuremberg Chronicles. And Albrecht Dürer was known for his ability to convey movement in his woodblocks. In this two-page spread, the point at which Jesus bears the cross to the place of his death in pain and sorrow and turmoil is contrasted with the comfort by which the Pope was transported. And so this was a visual satire comparing the irony of the two ideas. This is a how-to manual, how to wrestle. You can see that now there's generous use of white space. The enclosing of the illustrations within a border or frame is non-existent in this book. There's a greater sense of dynamic quality within the layout itself and within the illustrations. There's breathing room and informal use of white space. This is a broadside by Cranach the Younger, and if we compare that to a lot of, shall we say, news magazines and fashion magazines of our current day, there are stylistic standards that still apply. We have the convention of the masthead at the top and minimal headlines. We have the large portrait, and we have secondary type. And in the case of Time magazine, we even have the framing device which closes the composition. So again, making connections between what was and what is. In France, the illustrated book followed the forms of the illuminated manuscripts. They were dense and complex. Their complexity of illustration, typography, and ornament all fitted very tightly into the space on the page. In Spain, there was a great use of white on black and heraldic imagery in the Spanish picture book and in most Spanish graphic design in the 1500s. And notice again the juxtaposition of pattern and the use of the frame and the separation of the type from the actual illustration. Again, very different from the later German illustrated books, the one we saw with the two wrestlers, where white space was definitely in support of the figurative elements. So every time there is a big innovation in something, there are myriad things that spring from it, not just in terms of further technology, but in terms of cultural impact. And in this case, the rise of printing supported the rise of literacy and education. The rise of printing supported the separation of the Protestant Church from the established Roman Catholic Church. As already mentioned, printing made scientific thought, linear thinking, reasoning, even critical thinking more possible. Not that human beings were without that capacity prior to this technology, but this technology supported and enhanced and gave rise to further development in it.